The case of Officer Mallory. Judge Clarence Abernathy, a man whose name resonated with respect throughout the county courthouse, massaged his temples. The persistent throb behind his eyes was a familiar accompaniment to the gavel he wielded each day. He'd mediated a squabble between warring siblings over their deceased mother's prized antique collection, presided over a complex fraud case involving elaborate offshore accounts, and patiently explained the intricacies of jury duty to a roomful of bewildered college students. He navigated the treacherous waters of the legal system, ensuring the principles of fairness and impartiality were upheld with every decision. He saw the law as a moral compass, guiding society toward justice and equality. Now, the fading sunlight painted the city in hues of orange and lavender as he drove his luxurious, deep emerald green Bentley Continental GT, a self-indulgent purchase after decades dedicated to the public good. The smooth ride and hushed interior were a welcome sanctuary after the day's cacophony. Suddenly, the pulsating blue and red lights filling his rearview mirror ripped him from his reverie. He glanced at his speedometer, perfectly within the limit. He signaled, carefully eased the car onto the shoulder, and shifted it into park. The Bentley's engine idled with a refined growl. He lowered the window, expecting the usual brief encounter. A young, female officer, her face obscured by the glare from the oncoming headlights, approached his vehicle. She was tall and slender, with a rigid posture that spoke volumes. "License and registration, please," she stated, her voice sharp and devoid of warmth. Judge Abernathy reached into his glove compartment, his movements deliberate and unhurried, reflecting his years of experience on the bench. He retrieved the requested documents and handed them over. The officer took them, but her gaze remained fixed on him. "Is this your car, sir?" she inquired, her tone laced with barely concealed skepticism. "Yes, officer, it is," Judge Abernathy replied calmly. "Registered and insured in my name." He gestured towards the paperwork in her hand. She didn't bother looking down. "It's a very impressive car," she commented, her eyes scanning him from his impeccably tailored suit, slightly rumpled after a long day in court, to his distinguished, silver-streaked hair. The unspoken, for someone like you, hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence in the confined space. Judge Abernathy felt a familiar wave of weariness wash over him. He'd faced this kind of subtle, insidious prejudice countless times before. The assumption that certain achievements, certain luxuries, were unattainable, even impossible, for those who didn't conform to a narrow, preconceived image. The injustice stung even after all this time. "Officer," he said, his voice maintaining an even tone, "my license and registration are valid. Perhaps if you would simply verify them." She scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. "Right. You expect me to believe you own this." She gestured contemptuously at the Bentley with the back of her hand, as if it were some sort of gaudy, ill-gotten trophy. "People like you don't drive cars like this." Judge Abernathy's weariness threatened to morph into something sharper, something angrier. He was tired, yes, but more than that, he was deeply disheartened. He, who had dedicated his life to upholding the principles of equal justice, was now confronted with blatant prejudice from someone sworn to protect and serve those very principles. "Officer," he said, his voice taking on a firmer edge, "with all due respect, I am Judge Clarence Abernathy. My identification and registration are in your hand. I request you perform your duty and check them." She remained unmoved, her expression hardening. "Judge, huh? Right, and I'm the First Lady of the United States." She tapped the radio on her shoulder. "Dispatch, requesting backup at my location. Possible imposter attempting to impersonate a judge. Possible stolen vehicle involved." Judge Abernathy stared at her in disbelief. Imposter? Stolen vehicle? He was a pillar of the community, a respected jurist. This was utterly absurd. Within minutes, the flashing lights intensified as another patrol car, its siren wailing briefly, screeched to a halt behind Officer Mallory's vehicle. A second officer emerged, younger and even more imposing, his expression mirroring Mallory's suspicion. "What's the situation, Mallory?" he asked, approaching the driver's side of Judge Abernathy's car. "Possible stolen vehicle, Officer Davis," Mallory stated, her voice still dripping with self-righteousness. "Driver claiming to be a judge, but—" She rolled her eyes, leaving the rest unsaid. Davis peered into the car, his gaze hard and assessing. Just as Judge Abernathy was about to reiterate his identity, a third vehicle arrived, a dark, unmarked sedan, instantly recognizable as belonging to someone of higher rank. Sergeant Miller stepped out, his demeanor calm and authoritative. He surveyed the scene, his eyes landing first on Judge Abernathy, then on Mallory and Davis. "What's going on here, officers?" Sergeant Miller inquired, his voice low but carrying. Mallory, puffing out her chest slightly, began to explain, repeating her accusations about the imposter and the stolen vehicle, her tone still laced with disbelief. Sergeant Miller listened patiently, his gaze occasionally flickering back to Judge Abernathy, who sat with his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, his expression now a mixture of resignation and quiet anger. When Mallory finished her somewhat theatrical explanation, Sergeant Miller turned to Judge Abernathy. "Sir, could I see your identification, please?" It was a stark contrast to Mallory's accusatory tone. Judge Abernathy nodded and retrieved his judge's identification card from his wallet, handing it to Sergeant Miller. Miller took it, examined it closely, then looked at Judge Abernathy's face, comparing it to the picture on the card. A flicker of recognition, then respect, crossed his features. Sergeant Miller turned back to Mallory, his voice now carrying a distinct edge. "Officer Mallory," he said, holding up the judge's ID and the registration, which she still held crumpled in her hand. "Have you checked these documents?" Mallory shifted her weight, avoiding his gaze. "Well, no, Sergeant. Not yet, but—" "Not yet," Sergeant Miller repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Officer, procedure dictates that you verify identification and registration before making assumptions, especially assumptions based on—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Preconceived notions." He turned back to Judge Abernathy, extending his hand in apology. "Judge Abernathy, I apologize profusely for this inconvenience. Officer Mallory made an error in judgment, and I assure you it will be addressed. Please forgive the unprofessionalism of this encounter." Judge Abernathy took the sergeant's hand, his grip firm. "Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice regaining its resonant courtroom timbre, "while I appreciate your professionalism, this is more than an inconvenience. Officer Mallory hasn't simply made a mistake. She's allowed prejudice to blind her to the very facts presented before her. My identification and registration have been in her hands since the moment she pulled me over, and she refused to even look at them." Sergeant Miller nodded grimly. He turned back to Mallory, his face hardening. "Officer Mallory, I want you to immediately check Judge Abernathy's documents. Verify his identity and the registration. Do it now." Reluctantly, Mallory unfolded the registration and finally glanced at the judge's ID. Her face paled slightly as the reality of her blunder, the sheer magnitude of her misjudgment, began to sink in. The name on the registration matched the name on the ID. The address matched the prestigious address of a judge in the city's records. It was all there, in black and white, irrefutable. She stammered, "Sergeant, I just nothing, officer." Sergeant Miller cut her off, his voice cold. "You allowed your assumptions to override procedure, common sense, and basic respect. You escalated a routine stop into a potential incident based on nothing but your own biases." He turned back to Judge Abernathy. "Judge, I'm going to have a conversation with Officer Mallory. Please allow me to personally ensure you're on your way. Again, my deepest apologies." Judge Abernathy watched as Sergeant Miller stepped away with a subdued and clearly chastened Officer Mallory. He saw her gesturing defensively, still seemingly trying to justify her actions. But Sergeant Miller's posture remained unyielding. He sat for a moment longer, the flashing lights reflecting in the polished finish of his car, the irony not lost on him. He, the arbiter of justice, had been presumed guilty until, and even after, proven innocent. When Sergeant Miller returned, he offered another sincere apology. "Judge Abernathy, please go home. We'll take care of things here. Again, my deepest apologies." Judge Abernathy nodded, a weary sigh escaping his lips. He put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road, leaving behind the flashing lights and the lingering taste of injustice. As he drove, the city lights seemed less golden, more harsh and impersonal. He thought of the laws he'd upheld that day, laws meant to protect everyone, regardless of appearance or circumstance. He thought of Officer Mallory, her unwavering conviction in her own prejudice. Even when faced with undeniable truth, he knew Sergeant Miller would likely address the officer's blatant misconduct, but would it be enough to truly change her perception, to dismantle the biases that had driven her actions that night? He wasn't sure. And that, Judge Abernathy realized with a heavy heart, was perhaps the most disheartening verdict of all. The law could be upheld, processes maintained, apologies issued, but dismantling the ingrained prejudices that lurked beneath the surface, the ones that could so easily twist justice into something ugly and unfair, that was a battle fought on a different, far more complex battlefield. And tonight, despite all his efforts in court, it felt like a battle the very concept of true justice had just narrowly lost on the side of a dark road. He arrived home, the grandeur of his Tudor-style house offering little solace. The incident replayed in his mind, each word, each gesture, amplified by the quiet of the evening. He poured himself a generous glass of scotch, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass. He needed something to cut through the lingering bitterness. He sat in his study, surrounded by the comforting presence of leather-bound books and antique furniture, yet he felt strangely adrift. The weight of the day, compounded by the encounter with Officer Mallory, pressed down on him. He considered calling his wife, Eleanor, but decided against it. She was a compassionate and insightful woman, but he didn't want to burden her with his frustration. She had her own challenges, running a successful nonprofit dedicated to providing legal aid to underprivileged communities. He often wondered if she, too, encountered the same insidious prejudices he faced, though perhaps in different forms. He took a sip of the scotch, the smoky flavor momentarily distracting him from his thoughts. He looked at the framed photographs on his desk. Eleanor, radiant and smiling. His children, now grown and pursuing their own careers. His grandchildren, their faces full of innocent joy. He was a lucky man, he knew that. He had a loving family, a fulfilling career, and a comfortable life. Yet, incidents like tonight's served as a stark reminder that those blessings were not universally shared, that the playing field was far from level. He decided to channel his frustration into something productive. He opened his laptop and began to draft a letter to the chief of police, detailing the events of the evening and expressing his concerns about the potential for bias within the police department. He knew the letter might not bring about immediate change, but it was a start. It was a way to use his position, his voice, to advocate for justice, even in the face of personal humiliation. As he typed, his thoughts drifted back to Officer Mallory. He wondered what had led her to harbor such deep-seated prejudices. Was it her upbringing? Her training? Her experiences on the job? He knew that prejudice was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, often rooted in fear, ignorance, and a lack of empathy. He didn't hate Officer Mallory. He felt a certain pity for her. She was, in a way, a victim of her own biases, trapped within a narrow worldview that prevented her from seeing the world clearly. He hoped that Sergeant Miller would not only discipline her, but also provide her with the opportunity to learn and grow, to confront her prejudices and dismantle them. He finished the letter, reread it carefully, and saved it as a draft. He would review it again in the morning before sending it. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, the scotch warming his throat. He felt a little better, a little more in control. He had done what he could. He had spoken truth to power. He got up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. He thought about the countless cases he had presided over, the lives he had touched, the injustices he had tried to right. He knew that the pursuit of justice was a never-ending journey, a constant struggle against the forces of prejudice and inequality. But he also knew that it was a journey worth taking, a struggle worth fighting. He went to bed, but sleep was elusive. He tossed and turned, his mind racing. He kept seeing Officer Mallory's face, her eyes filled with suspicion and disdain. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more needed to be done. The next morning, Judge Abernathy woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He reread his letter to the chief of police and, after making a few minor adjustments, sent it. But he knew that wasn't enough. He needed to do more to address the issue of bias within the criminal justice system. He decided to reach out to Eleanor, his wife. He knew she had a wealth of experience working with underprivileged communities and fighting for social justice. He told her about the incident with Officer Mallory and his concerns about the potential for bias within the police department. Eleanor listened patiently, her expression thoughtful. "Clarence," she said, "I understand your frustration, but I also know that change takes time. It's not something that happens overnight." "I know, Eleanor," he replied, "but I can't just sit back and do nothing. I have a responsibility to use my position to make a difference." Eleanor smiled. "I know you do, Clarence, and I'm proud of you for wanting to do something. But let's think about this strategically. What can we do that will have the greatest impact?" They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas. They considered organizing workshops for police officers on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. They discussed creating a mentorship program that would pair young officers with community leaders from diverse backgrounds. They even talked about establishing a civilian review board to investigate complaints of police misconduct. Finally, they settled on a plan. They would partner with Eleanor's nonprofit to create a series of community forums designed to foster dialogue between law enforcement officials and the communities they served. The forums would provide a safe space for residents to voice their concerns and for officers to listen and learn. They would also offer training sessions on implicit bias and cultural competency for officers and community members alike. Judge Abernathy and Eleanor knew that their plan was ambitious, but they were determined to make it work. They believed that by fostering understanding and empathy between law enforcement officials and the communities they served, they could begin to dismantle the prejudices that plagued the criminal justice system. They immediately set to work, contacting community leaders, law enforcement officials, and potential funders. They were met with a mix of skepticism and enthusiasm, but they persevered, convinced that their efforts would ultimately make a difference. Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, their plan began to take shape. They secured funding from several foundations and corporations. They recruited a team of experienced facilitators to lead the community forums. They partnered with the local police department to develop a training curriculum on implicit bias and cultural competency. Finally, the day arrived for the first community forum. Judge Abernathy and Eleanor were nervous, but they were also filled with hope. They had worked tirelessly to create a welcoming and inclusive environment, and they were eager to see if their efforts would pay off. The forum was held at a local community center, and it was packed with people from all walks of life: police officers, community leaders, residents, students, and even a few journalists. Judge Abernathy and Eleanor greeted each participant with a warm smile and a handshake. The forum began with a series of presentations from community leaders and law enforcement officials, who spoke about the importance of building trust and understanding between the police and the communities they served. Then, the participants broke into small groups to discuss their own experiences with the criminal justice system. Judge Abernathy and Eleanor circulated among the groups, listening to the conversations and offering encouragement. They were struck by the honesty and vulnerability of the participants. People shared stories of discrimination, mistreatment, and fear. But they also shared stories of hope, resilience, and reconciliation. As the forum progressed, Judge Abernathy noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The initial tension and suspicion began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of openness and empathy. People began to see each other as individuals, rather than as stereotypes. They began to understand each other's perspectives. At the end of the forum, Judge Abernathy and Eleanor felt a sense of profound satisfaction. They knew that their work was far from over, but they had taken a significant step towards building a more just and equitable community. In the weeks and months that followed, Judge Abernathy and Eleanor continued to organize community forums and training sessions. They saw firsthand the impact of their efforts. Police officers began to treat community members with more respect and understanding. Community members began to trust the police more, and the criminal justice system began to operate more fairly. One day, Judge Abernathy received a phone call from Sergeant Miller. He had some interesting news to share. "Judge," Sergeant Miller began, "I wanted to let you know that Officer Mallory has completed her disciplinary action and has been reassigned to a new precinct." "Oh," Judge Abernathy replied, intrigued. "And how is she doing?" "Well," Sergeant Miller said, "that's the interesting part. After the incident with you, Officer Mallory went through a period of reflection. She attended several of the community forums, and she even participated in the implicit bias training. And I have to say, she's a changed person." "Really?" Judge Abernathy asked, surprised. "How so?" "Well," Sergeant Miller explained, "she's more open-minded, more empathetic, and more willing to listen to different perspectives. She's also become a strong advocate for community policing. In fact, she's even volunteered to be a mentor to new officers, teaching them about the importance of cultural sensitivity and respect." Judge Abernathy was deeply moved by Sergeant Miller's words. He had never expected Officer Mallory to change her ways, but he was thrilled to hear that she had. It was a testament to the power of education, empathy, and second chances. A few weeks later, Judge Abernathy received a visit from Officer Mallory herself. She stood nervously in his office, her eyes downcast. "Judge Abernathy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior that night. I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Judge Abernathy smiled warmly. "Officer Mallory," he said, "your apology is accepted. But more importantly, I'm proud of you for taking responsibility for your actions and for working to change your ways. You've shown that it's possible to overcome prejudice and to become a better person." Officer Mallory looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Judge," she said. "Your kindness means more to me than you know." Judge Abernathy and Officer Mallory shook hands, a gesture of forgiveness and reconciliation. It was a moment that symbolized the transformative power of justice. From that day forward, Judge Abernathy continued to advocate for justice and equality in his community. He knew that the struggle against prejudice and discrimination was far from over, but he was determined to do his part to create a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. The scars of that night on the road remained, but now they were a reminder of how far he, and perhaps even the system, had come.